close the door? Should we close the door? Probably not. All right. My name is Tom Mensick. I'm a museum technician with the Louisville Historical Museum. And I'm going to talk today about Bert Niehoff, who is one of Louisville's more famous residents. He was born on May 13th, 1884. And he was born in one of the oldest houses here in Louisville, which is this one right in the corner there. And it actually is currently the headquarters for the Louisville Parks and Rec Department. But it also was on, its address is at 717 Main Street, so it's pretty much right next to City Hall. So Niehoff was actually the last child of 6 to the Niehoff family. And as a child, he was pretty athletic. He would go play baseball over at Miners Field, which is over on Highway 42. And as a kid, I would do a lot of kid things, as you would do back in the day. This is a picture of him as a young man with a bicycle. But baseball really wasn't in his career path early on, and he took a job as an electrician in Denver in 1905. Unfortunately, a labor strike for electricians in Denver happened in 1907, and he was forced to leave Denver and moved south to Trinidad on the tip from a friend that had contacts down there. So this is kind of really where his baseball career got started, was in southern Colorado. He joined up with a local amateur team in Trinidad, and as an amateur baseball player, would often go around and play other amateur baseball teams. Mostly they were made up of company teams as well, so right nowadays, if you kind of think of a slow-pitch softball team that's sponsored by the place you work, that's kind of how it operated back then. But in 1907, he tried his hand at joining professional leagues and tried out for the Pueblo Indians of the Western League as a pitcher, but unfortunately, he was not a very good pitcher and was cut shortly after. But he was undeterred by this and decided to keep trying his luck in the minors. So he, the next season for 1908, transitioned to the infield and took a third base position with a team in Des Moines called the Des Moines Boosters. So before I kind of go into what his career was like, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the structure of baseball a little bit before we talk about his career. So in 1907, there were 36 different minor leagues and spread out over 244 different cities. This gave an opportunity to baseball fans across the country that could watch pretty good professional baseball that could not go to a normal major league game that you would see in Chicago or Pittsburgh or Cleveland or New York or Boston at the time. And a lot like today, the minor leagues were kind of the conduit for which players would make it to the major leagues. So major league scouts would often go to these small towns and cities and give tryouts to the prime players within each league. And it was tiered as well, so much like it is today, you would have a top tier level and then a bottom tier level kind of spread out over this 36 different leagues. And that's kind of what the National Association of Professional Ball Players did in 1913, is they organized all these tiers and these leagues into more of an organized system, so it wasn't just a rabble of random teams across the country. So even today, some of these minor league teams are known for their flashy and funny names. For instance, like the Rockies, their minor league teams, the AAA affiliate is called the Albuquerque Isotopes, famously named after a Simpsons episode, if you've ever seen that one. Their second tier team is called the Hartford Yard Goats, and then they have a rookie development league in Grand Junction called the Grand Junction Rockies. But back then, they kind of still had that tradition of these kind of funny names. For instance, Lincoln, Nebraska had the Lincoln Tree Planters. Des Moines had another team known as the Des Moines Champs. New Bedford, Connecticut had the New Bedford Whales. And Worcester, Massachusetts had the Worcester Busters. Try to say that 100 times fast. San Francisco had a good one called the San Francisco Orphans. San Jose had another good one called the San Jose Prune Pickers. Leavenworth, Kansas even had one named the Leavenworth Convicts. Now, it wasn't made up of convicts, but when you think of Leavenworth, Kansas, you think of the massive prison there. And Denver had a team called the Denver Grizzlies, which would later go on to become the Denver Bears. So unfortunately, at this time period in professional baseball, there was also a group of players that were excluded from playing in both the majors and the minor leagues. Pardon me. And these were black players. There was a portion of untapped talent with black players that were not allowed to play in the major leagues. And it was due to what was called the Gentleman's Agreement. And basically, there was no explicit rule that banned black players from playing in Major League Baseball. There was just an agreement between most Major League owners, if not all of them, and a lot of the minor league owners to exclude black players from playing professional baseball. However, this didn't stop many black players from creating what were called barnstorming teams. And these barnstorming teams would go around the country to different regions, sometimes playing 2 or 3 games in a day, and oftentimes playing some of the minor league teams that had not let them join. And so a lot of the great players, black players from this era were never able to translate their skills into Major League Baseball. A few of the more prominent black teams at this time, there was the Cuban American Giants, the Detroit Stars, the Indianapolis ABCs, and the Cuban X-Giants. Now, the Negro Leagues themselves were actually formed into a actual baseball league in 1923 by Andrew Rube Foster, and he was one of the best black pitchers of all time at that era, but he was unfortunately never able to play in the major leagues, but he's believed to be one of the greatest pitchers of all time. So at this point, it's likely that Niehoff, during his amateur playing days and early minor league days, would have played some of these barnstorming Negro League teams, as they were called. So the Negro Leagues, unfortunately, had a somewhat bittersweet collapse. So from 1923 to 1950, they held 27 successful seasons, even playing major league teams in exhibition games, playing minor league teams in exhibition games, and even playing in major league stadiums, even though most of them would never be able to make it in Major League Baseball, according to the major league owners. However, Branch Rickey ended the gentleman's agreement in 1946 by signing Jackie Robinson to a minor league contract, and then in 1947 signing Jackie Robinson again to a major league contract, and he started at first base for the Brooklyn Dodgers that season. And after that, most every other major league owner decided that they were leaving an untapped resource of great players excluded from the game. And so after 1947, a flood of black players began to make their way into the major leagues, and the Negro Leagues folded in 1950, just unable to sustain because of lack of talent that was eventually going to make it to the major leagues. So the development of this league, as well as the development of the minor league, also showed that how popular baseball was at this time period. Multiple professional leagues running at the same time is kind of unheard of in today's world. You know, you have the big four sports leagues, but back then you had 3 or 4 different professional baseball leagues. You could go watch a game pretty much in any city or town or region in the country, regardless of race, or if you wanted to watch good baseball, you could find it anywhere. So while the barnstorming teams were traveling across the country, Niehoff was getting settled into his career in the minor leagues. So going back to 1908, Niehoff began to establish himself in Des Moines with the Boosters and playing third base. And so his first season in the minors was pretty rough, but Des Moines decided to give him a second chance for 1909. And in 1909, he hit a pretty respectable .269 batting average. And then, so this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, how major league teams would begin to scout the minor league teams. And so in 1910, the Chicago White Sox decided to give Niehoff a chance to make it to the majors and try out for the 1910 season. But unfortunately, he started out pretty rough and was not able to make the White Sox out of spring training and was sent down to the major leagues once again for Des Moines. But in 1910, he did perform very well, hitting pretty good .293 for Des Moines. And again in 1911, he was offered another chance to make it to the major leagues with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And but he kind of, in a way, shot himself in the foot, because he was very adept at negotiating contracts, but not early on. He decided that he needed to negotiate harder with the Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Pittsburgh Pirates ownership did not think that a player who had never played a major league game in his life should dictate their contractual terms to him, and coupled that with another slow start in spring, Niehoff was forced to go back down to the minors for the beginning of 1911. So he was first demoted to Indianapolis, where he had another slow start, and then was again demoted down to the Omaha Rourkes. So unfortunately, his major league career was looking pretty grim at this point. But by 1912, he had moved up to the Louisville Colonels, which are actually in Louisville, Kentucky, not Colorado, and played 2 seasons there, and again was scouted by another professional team, the Cincinnati Reds. Finally, he got his shot in the major leagues. The Reds decided that they needed a third baseman, and they called up Niehoff for the last 2 weeks of the season. And on October 4th, 1913, Bert Niehoff finally made it into the major leagues and played the final 2 weeks of the 1913 season with the Reds. So before I kind of go into his major league career, I kind of want to discuss what baseball, at least Major League Baseball, was like at this point, because it was a completely different game than what you see today in many respects. Today there's a lot of home runs, and the dead ball era was marked by little offense and very few home runs. In fact, the home run leader at this point between 1900 and 1920 was a gentleman by the name of Roger Connor. And he was the home run leader up until Babe Ruth broke his record. And it took him 18 seasons to compile 138 home runs. So that's not very much. Some players today can compile 138 home runs in about 5 or 6 seasons if you're really cranking them out. But at this time period, home runs and hitting were not very high. Also, pitchers at this point were some of the greatest pitchers of all time pitched during this era. They had several advantages, including the spitball, which meant that they would take tobacco juice, kind of get it all roughed up in their mouth, spit it on the ball, mash it up to get a better grip. They would also take files and blades and kind of doctor the baseball to get better grip and have it hook better in the air. Completely illegal, but it was never really enforced. So by the end of the game, the baseball would actually look just like a hunk of brown. It was basically like hitting a beanbag almost by the end of the game. Because also owners were cheap and didn't want to purchase more baseballs for a game. So by comparison today, in any given baseball game, both teams average about 65 baseballs to keep it fresh. Back then, they're using maybe 1 or 2 baseballs during the game, and so it just became pretty gross after a while. And if you can't get a fresh baseball in the game, you're not going to be able to hit it very well. So this also caused hitters to decline as well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't any great offensive players. In fact, some of the greats of all time hit during this era, like Ty Cobb, who had over close to 4,200 hits in his career and had a lifetime batting average of .367. His kind of counterpart was Honus Wagner, who's a shortstop for the Pittsburgh Pirates. And Wagner and Ty Cobb were actually kind of personality foils for each other. So Honus Wagner was very graceful and personable. Fans loved him. The other players loved him, whereas Ty Cobb was not well liked by anybody, including his teammates. In fact, he often would go into the stands and berate fans that would hurl slurs at him. He at one point stabbed a bellboy, almost killing him. And that is why about 6 former players and teammates showed up at his funeral when he died. But in an ironic twist, Ty Cobb also was baseball's first millionaire player. He got the largest contract ever, but not $1 million contract. But he decided to invest in a small company out of Atlanta named Coca-Cola. And as Coca-Cola took off in the early 20th century, Ty Cobb made millions on the famous drink. Also, some of the great pitchers of this time included Christy Mathewson, who unfortunately his career was cut short after World War I when he joined up with the American troops and suffered a gas attack during the war and came back, tried to pitch but could never regain his form and unfortunately died due to those injuries. Three-Finger Mordecai Brown was a famous pitcher for the Chicago Cubs. He was called Three-Finger because he actually did have 3 fingers on his pitching hand, which I guess in some ways could be an advantage because it worked for him. He managed to turn a Hall of Fame career out of it. Charles Chief Bender was actually one of the only Native American players in baseball history, and famous Philadelphia Athletics manager Connie Mack said that Chief Bender was probably the greatest money pitcher of all time and would put him in any game over any pitcher he ever had. And then you had Walter Johnson, famous pitcher for the Washington Senators, and Babe Ruth, who at this time, surprisingly, was a left-handed pitcher with the Boston Red Sox before he became the famous slugger with the New York Yankees. And actually, Bert Niehoff would have a couple run-ins with Babe Ruth down the line, and we'll go over that here in a little bit. So the actual end of the dead ball era came when, in 1920, it had a very specific end. And this was because Major League Baseball, i.e. the American League and the National League, decided to implement new rules to kind of spark more offense in the game. Instead of having 1 or 2 baseball used during a game, they mandated that more baseballs were used so that to keep them fresher. They outlawed the spitball, and they outlawed the doctoring of baseballs as well, and were able to enforce that a little better. The other reason was Babe Ruth. And Babe Ruth single-handedly changed the game of baseball in 1919 when he hit 29 home runs, which was unbelievable at that time. But what he did in 1920 was even more unbelievable. After being traded to the Yankees, he hit 54 home runs that year. So Babe Ruth really brought in this new era of hitting and changed the game drastically. We got some pictures here. This is Ty Cobb right here for the Detroit Tigers. In the middle, we have Three-Finger Mordecai Brown, and then a picture of his pitching hand right there. So he lost his index finger. Next to him is center fielder Tris Speaker for the Boston Red Sox. Next to him is Rogers Hornsby, who is a second baseman for the St. Louis Cardinals. This is actually a young Babe Ruth pitching for the Boston Red Sox. And then Honus Wagner here in the middle. And this is probably one of my favorite baseball photos of all time. And if you ever happen to find yourself with a Honus Wagner baseball card, congratulations, because it is the most expensive baseball card in existence. And then at the end here, I decided to throw in one of the more famous managers of all time from this era. That is famed New York Giants manager John McGraw. He managed the Giants for 32 seasons. And he was affectionately nicknamed Little Napoleon, so I'm guessing from that you can kind of garner what his personality was like. And he was one of those guys that was really hard to play with, but considered one of the greatest managers of all time, winning close to 2,700 wins, having 2,700 wins in his managerial career. So some of the other reasons for the popularity spike in Major League Baseball at this time and what Niehoff was stepping into was the rise of the ballpark. Before owners decided to build more permanent ballparks, a lot of the ballparks were just these wood and dirt fields. They were somewhat structured, but overall they would mostly fall apart or burn down, and owners, instead of building a new stadium every 5 years, decided to invest in better construction and make a lasting impression with their team. So a lot of the new stadiums of this era were built with brick, steel, and cement, but they each had their own personality. For instance, Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, New York is one of the most beloved classic ballparks ever. It had these big cathedral windows, as you can see, producing a lot of natural light. And as you walked into the foyer here, there's marble flooring, marble walls, chandeliers hanging from the ceilings, and even the chandeliers were, I guess, a sphere, but it had red lacing painted on the sphere to make it look like big baseballs for the lighting. In the middle here, we have Fenway Park, and Fenway is famous for its green monster, but that wasn't installed yet when Fenway was built in 1912. But Fenway is known for its pretty interesting brickwork as well. The one on the far end there is Polo Grounds. And the Polo Grounds was interesting because it was 480 feet to deep center, but then about 258 feet right down the lines. So if you could pull a home run right down the line, you didn't have to hit it too far. And in fact, one of the greatest home runs of all time, Bobby Thompson, for the Giants to win the pennant, just barely hooked one right down the left field line and put it in the seats, clinching the Giants World Series. National League pennant, sorry. This one here is Wrigley Field. Wrigley is known for the brick outfield wall that the ivy grows on every summer. And then down here we have Shibe Park, and there were actually two teams in Philadelphia when Niehoff played for them. And this was where the Philadelphia Athletics played, and it was named Connie Mack Stadium later for Connie Mack, who had managed and eventually partially owned the Philadelphia Athletics for 50 seasons. So a couple more. These are the two ballparks that actually Niehoff would play in most of his career. So he made his major league debut at Crosley Field in Cincinnati, and then this is the Baker Bowl in Philadelphia, where he played the 3 seasons he played with Philadelphia there. So when Niehoff finally made it to the majors, he was kind of stepping into an interesting world there. And so the Reds decided to bring him on as a full-time starting third baseman in 1914. And he played 142 games for the Reds, pretty much the whole season at that point. He hit .242, and he led the team in triples and home runs, and he led the team in home runs with 4. Just again to show the lack of power during this time period. However, the Reds didn't feel that was good enough and traded him to the Philadelphia Phillies, which in turn was probably a pretty good move because the Phillies actually were a lot better team than the Reds were at that point. So this is actually a picture of Bert Niehoff. I have him circled there with the 1915 Philadelphia Phillies. And so he was actually paired with David Bancroft, who played shortstop. They moved Niehoff from third base to second base. And Niehoff and Bancroft really kind of formed this really interesting fielding duo. Bancroft was known for his fielding ability, while Niehoff was not very graceful. He actually led the team in errors that season, but also helped turn over 400 outs. So kind of a weird dichotomy of fielding, but made up for by Bancroft's excellent fielding. So for the Phillies, they actually ended up making it to the World Series that year, and they faced the Boston Red Sox, who were in the middle of one of their dynasties, actually their last dynasty, if you think about it, unfortunately. This was a string of 4 championships between 1912 and 1918, and then after 1918, they would not win another World Series until 2004. So enjoy it while it lasts, I guess, because sometimes you never know in baseball what can happen. But for 1916, it actually saw Bert Niehoff have his statistically best career in the big leagues. He helped turn 65 double plays at second and improved in defense, having 437 outs with Bancroft as well. He also led the majors in doubles and the National League and was second in the National League in extra base hits, which are just doubles, triples, and home runs. But for the Phillies, they unfortunately finished second that season to the Brooklyn Robins, who would eventually become the Brooklyn Dodgers. And then after 1916, Niehoff's career kind of started to decline a little bit. But being that he played for a fairly successful team, he was somewhat of a star. And so one of the great baseball foods you can ever get is Cracker Jacks, and they decided to put his likeness on a Cracker Jack baseball card that you could get in a box of Cracker Jacks. This is another team photo here of the Phillies from the 1915 World Series, and Niehoff is at the very far end there, and his battery mate at shortstop was Dave Bancroft, who's on the other end. So a couple more photos here. Another baseball card for Niehoff, and then kind of a action pose from Niehoff there at the beginning of spring. I like to point out the middle one, though, because when I show you another photo of him 2 years later, you can really see how much he was aged during the game. This was from his first season with Philadelphia, so 1915. But unfortunately, baseball careers must come to an end. And in 1917, the Philadelphia Phillies decided to move on from Niehoff as a full-time player and traded for Chicago Cubs second baseman Johnny Evers, who had a famous, when he was in Chicago, there were 3 famous infielders for the Cubs, and every time they would turn a double play, the fans would chant "Tinkers to Evers to Chance." And if you ever hear about Tinkers to Evers to Chance, that's the 3 players there. But Johnny Evers took over at second base for the Phillies, and Niehoff was unfortunately benched and would serve as a backup role at first and third base. The Phillies decided to fully move on from Niehoff and traded him during the season to the St. Louis Cardinals, where he only played in 22 games and his batting average dropped to 179 and was outright released by the Cardinals. So he was pretty much not playing baseball in 1918 until New York Giants lost their starting second baseman and asked Niehoff to come and play and cover while their second baseman recovered. 7 games into his Giants career, he was running out to catch a fly ball in center field and collided with the Giants center fielder and broke his leg right beneath the knee and pretty much ended his major league playing career right there. So going back to that picture with the Phillies, this is him and the Giants just 2 years later, and you can just see how more aged he is even 2 years later. It was a tough sport, and really took a lot out of you, especially if you were not used to being a starting player. These two pictures were him recovering. I'm not sure if those are in Louisville at all, but this is a lot different than today, where you can just kind of just have surgery after you break a bone and you go on the disabled list for 6 weeks. This was a long recovery for him, and the bone really had to come back together because it happened right below the knee, and so he couldn't put weight on it for a long time. Tried to make a comeback in 1919 with the Giants, but they decided not to re-sign him, and unfortunately his major league career was over. But that didn't stop him either. He kept playing in the minors, where he had spent most of his career already, and eventually transitioned more into a managerial role. And he would actually extend his career through managing. And at this time, a lot of players were doing what was called player managing, which means he would also play in the field but manage the game as well. And in 1922, he did this with the Mobile Bears, and actually played and managed the Bears to a Southern League championship, and had the best season of his career in 1922, hitting .295 and 10 home runs. But by 1928, he could no longer deal with the rigors of playing professional baseball every day, and retired from playing after a 21-year playing career that started in 1907. But he was a very good manager and stayed on to manage several other teams throughout the minor leagues, including the Mobile Bears, the Seattle Rainers, the Salt Lake Bees, and the Los Angeles Angels, which would later become the major league team, the Los Angeles Angels, in 1961, as well as the Chattanooga Lookouts. And he helped Mobile and Chattanooga both win Southern League championships. He also managed the Louisville Colonels, who gave him one of his early shots in the minors. He coached in Knoxville and Little Rock and Oklahoma City as well. Whoa. Not there yet. So, while with Chattanooga, he actually had one of the most folkloric kind of incidents in baseball history that is still kind of argued about by baseball historians even now. So in 1931, the New York Yankees went down to Chattanooga to play Niehoff's Chattanooga Lookouts for an exhibition game. This was during the Yankees, one of their dynasties they had. Their team was loaded, and they had Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. And as you see, that Niehoff kind of ran up against Babe Ruth a lot in his career. This is one of the more interesting moments. So the Yankees are playing the Lookouts, and on the Lookouts, there's a 17-year-old girl pitcher named Jackie Mitchell. And Jackie Mitchell was summoned into the game after his original starting pitcher was getting knocked around a bit. And you have even, anyone that has to face Babe Ruth and then Lou Gehrig, it's not going to be fun really for anybody. So she took the mound and stared down at Babe Ruth standing in the box. This is Sultan of SWAT. Babe Ruth, what more can you say? Throws her first pitch, Ruth swings and misses. So he's kind of freaked out, steps back, it's like, okay, I'm just going to take this one over the fence because I'm Babe Ruth, and who's this little 17-year-old girl? What is this? Steps back in, Jackie Mitchell gets the ball, throws it in, Babe Ruth, mighty hack, swings and misses again. This time he's getting upset. And so he steps back in the box. You can probably guess that he's pretty angry at this point and just wants to punish it. So he steps in, Jackie Mitchell throws. Instead of swinging, he sits and watches it go by. Umpire calls him out on strikes. Babe Ruth loses his mind. He throws his bat, gets in the umpire's face, starts yelling at the umpire, and has to be restrained by his teammates and pulled off the field. And so then up next is Lou Gehrig. So, okay, you put down Babe Ruth, you still have Lou Gehrig to deal with. Lou Gehrig actually had a little bit more class and gravitas than Babe Ruth did at some times. And she struck out Lou Gehrig too. And so he ended up, going back to the dugout because he's a pro. And it is what it is. Unfortunately, this has been kind of semi-mythologized, and a lot of people think that it was a setup, but I'm going to tell you why I don't think it was a setup or a novelty act. Shortly after this incident happened, baseball commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis took Jackie Mitchell's contract and voided it. She is no longer allowed to play in professional baseball ever again. He also banned any women from playing in baseball ever again. Which, it doesn't really stand anymore, but he outright banned Jackie Mitchell, who had struck out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, two of the stars. So I believe that this was not an act, as some people have said, but I think that Jackie Mitchell legitimately went out there and struck out two Hall of Famers. Niehoff, whether he was just trying to scout talent or wanted to see what would happen if he put Jackie Mitchell against these two players, we'll never know because he never really talked about it later, but it's interesting to kind of speculate his reasoning because it was a spring training game. It was an exhibition game for Chattanooga, so they're trying to figure out what kind of talent they have. And so it's possible that he was just like, hey, I'm going to throw her out there and see how she does against two of the best players in the world. And she did just fine. So another time that Niehoff made strides was he joined in with the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. If you've ever seen the movie A League of Their Own, it really goes into talk about this league. It's the famous Tom Hanks and Gina Davis movie. So the American Girls Professional League was created in 1942 as a professional league to provide fans with more baseball. A lot of the minor league teams were depleted of young men that were sent off to fight in World War II in Europe and the Pacific. A lot of the major league teams were depleted as well. So unfortunately, a lot of the owners wanted to fill the stadium. And so the women stepped up and formed their own baseball league. And at its height, they had 12 teams, and they would travel to different cities and play each other. They had a World Series, they had playoffs, they would do barnstorming games. So, they were a very legitimate team, a league, and fans came out to watch because Americans love baseball. It doesn't matter where it's played or who it's played by, Americans will come watch baseball. And also the major league product during World War II was not that great. While there were some still good players in there, a lot of the players were past their prime because they were too old to be drafted, and so a lot of the major league teams had to rely on some older, less talented players. And it's interesting because during this time, the Boston Braves, which were historically one of the worst teams ever, ended up winning a World Series during World War II, or shortly after, so it really kind of shows that the lack of talent in baseball would lead to the Braves winning a World Series. But Niehoff actually joined several former Major League players to manage one of the more famous women's professional baseball league teams, and this is Niehoff right there. So a women's team consisted of a manager from a former MLB team, and then they'd have a chaperone, who is this very matronly lady at the end, and she would make sure that the women and the girls behaved off the field. They were taught how to dress. They were taught how to, walk and behave in public and etiquette. But on the baseball field, all bets were off. They played hard. They slid into each other. They knocked each other out. They played just as hard as the men did. But off the field, they had to, carry themselves as dignified young women. Whereas major league players, the men could go off and carouse and drink and get in fights and stab bellboys like Ty Cobb did. So maybe some of the major league teams would need a chaperone or two to keep those guys in line. All right, so that was in 1944 when he managed the Blue Sox. And he decided to step away from managing altogether in 1954. However, baseball called him back 7 years later when the Los Angeles Angels were created as a major league expansion team. At this time in his life, Bert Niehoff was living in Southern California, and the Angels hired him to be a scout for Southern California, and so he scouted young talent for the Angels for 7 seasons. And then he finally stepped away from baseball in 1967, and it capped a 6-decade-long career both playing, managing, and scouting. So he got to see several developments, as we talked about, the evolution of the minor leagues, the gentleman's agreement going into effect and finally coming down. He saw one of the greatest kind of baseball folklore events in the Jackie Mitchell story. He coached in women's baseball and saw the rise of women's baseball. He's one of those players and managers that, you know, when you have a manager, a lot of times it's not necessarily a superstar that comes back and manages the team. It's usually kind of a lower level to mid-level player that was fairly decent in his career, but for some reason he knows how to lead the other players, because I think he can relate to that kind of that drive and kind of that, trying to think of the word here, that grit that it takes if you're not a superstar to make it. So I think he could bring out the best in some of those types of players. And that's why I think he was able to spend 6 decades in professional baseball. And he did finally pass away in 1974 in Inglewood, California, where he's buried today next to his wife. And I'd like to thank you, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'll bring around a microphone for you.
You mentioned that he had a couple other run-ins with the Babe. I'd be interested in hearing about those. And what was the average salary, more or less, for an average ball player in that early stage of the game?
Okay. Well, Babe Ruth, he played in the 1915 World Series when Ruth was a pitcher. And then again with Jackie Mitchell, and those were the 2 major times that he came up against Babe Ruth. So I think Ruth actually, the Red Sox beat the Phillies, I think it was 4-1 in that series. And I think Ruth pitched one of the winning games against the Philadelphia. So the other one was baseball players. So when Ty Cobb, just to kind of put it into perspective, he was one of the first $10,000 players. And $10,000 for a season back then was like a $25 million a year player now. And so if Ty Cobb's making 10, then your average player is probably making between $800 to $1,000 a season. And that's why a lot of players, if you weren't a superstar, ended up having a second job in the off season. I'm sure Niehoff, when he wasn't playing, had 2 or 3 jobs in the off season to stay in shape, but also to keep food on the table. It was, you know, a rough life. There was no league minimum like there is today. I mean, the minor league players now make $125,000, I think, is the minor league minimum. So you can live off $125,000, but even back then, $800 to $1,000 is not that much money. Yeah.
Sorry. From the pictures you showed, it looked like they were always wooden bats, but I was wondering, in the minor leagues, did they ever toy with the metal bat?
Not really. They do in college. They do play with metal bats in college. I think in the minors they want to keep it as close to the majors as possible. But yeah, they never really used metal bats in the minor leagues. It would just be too, I mean, it would just be too, the players are so good that with a metal bat it could be pretty gnarly.
Yes, I'm from Superior, and one of our people over Superior has run across a name called Lenny Metz, who was supposedly from Superior, who made it into the majors. Did you run across his name in your research?
I didn't, but I guess that's my sequel speech now. So I have heard the name, but I didn't come across any correlation between Niehoff and Metz, but I'll look into that for sure.
Why is that one baseball card the most, hard to get one?
I think it's just rare, because it was one of the first baseball cards ever made. And it's just, there weren't that many printed, and I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it has sold at auction for upwards of $5 million. Yeah. And it's, it's sometimes, it's one of those stories where someone will run across it in a garage sale and, not really for 25 cents, and then they have a $5 million baseball card, so.
One thing that he had is, sorry, I don't mean to take the last. The reason it was expensive is because they advertised tobacco on it and then they stopped.
Yeah.
And then there was only a few of them made. And they found out there was only 5 or 6 of them left for a while. That was part of why it was so expensive.
Yeah, just the rarity too.
They found it in the garage, in their attic.
Yeah.
How old was this young man when he retired from baseball?
So,
I missed the beginning portion.
oh, no problem. So he was born in 1884, and so his first season in the minors was 1908, and so he was 26 at that point, and then played for 21 seasons. So he stopped playing when he was about 46, 47.
How many balls did you say they use in a game these days?
Today they use on average about 65 baseballs a game, total, so in one game. And a lot of times it's not just because a home run is hit. Pitchers are kind of neurotic nowadays, and if the ball just has the slightest bit of dust on it, then they'll throw it back to the umpire and get a new ball. But it's mostly, again, just to keep it fresh so it just doesn't fall apart. But a lot of those baseballs are used for practice the next day or tossed to fans. So,
Did he ever come back to Louisville?
not that I found out. He kind of left Louisville when he moved to southern Colorado. He may have come back to visit family and stuff, but as far as living here, he, based on his career and he's kind of nomadic, really. He coached all over, mostly in kind of the Midwest and southern states, but he never really came back to live in Louisville after he left originally. Anyone else?
Thank you so much, Tom. That was great.
I live in Arvada, but